All right, so I think we will go ahead and get started. Today's speaker is Sarah Moran. I want to thank her for agreeing to talk to us today about the chemistry of super Earth and Mini-Neptune Hazes. Sarah's originally from Kansas City, Missouri. She completed her undergraduate degree at Columbia University and is currently a PhD candidate in the Earth and Planetary Sciences at Johns Hopkins, working with Sarah Horst's lab. Sarah has also worked as a research assistant at the Space Telescope Science Institute and has interned at the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine. So Sarah, I'll take it over to you.
Thanks again. Thanks for having me. Today, I'm mostly going to focus on the stuff that I've been doing in the lab, but towards the end, I'll touch a little bit on how we've been trying to use what we've learned from the lab in actually atmospheric models. So I want to zoom out for just a second and sort of motivate why we should care about exoplanets at all. I suspect I'm kind of preaching to the choir here, but I'll just do it anyway, because I think it's important to kind of remember why we do this. And for me, exoplanets kind of represent all of the end member cases of planet formation and evolution. So we just have a small sampling here of our solar system, but it's only once we are able to look out and see all the various possibilities that I think we can really understand how planets form and evolve. So the technique that I mostly focus on, not necessarily in the lab, but when I pretend to play a theorist for observers, is transmission spectroscopy. And so to remind you how that works, I really love this animation that Zafar Rustamkulov, who's actually a grad student also at Hopkins with me, made. And so what you're seeing is as this planet, this black dot, passes in front of the star, and we're looking through different wavelengths of light, you can see the apparent size of the planet is changing based on how much light its atmosphere is absorbing. And if we then translate that picture to something, a graph, we see something like on the right. So you can see, we can actually detect particular molecules or the signature of Rayleigh scattering. So you see here we have potassium, sodium, and some hydrogen, as well as the Rayleigh scattering imparted by hydrogen. And so it would be nice if we got that top plot with just very smooth, we can see exactly what's there, but of course that's not the case. Right now, we're limited to just a few discrete data points that we can get with observatories like Hubble. So that's more what you get in the bottom, where I've just outlined those very few points that we actually are getting right now, and then having to extrapolate back to what it is that we're actually seeing from the planetary atmosphere. And I just want to point out, again, to bring this closer to home for a second, that this is true on all planets with atmospheres. So right now I'm showing you an image of Earth as you pan through different wavelengths. And so you can actually see that the planet looks larger when we go to the ozone band, because we're seeing all of that absorption from ozone that we don't see in visible light. And then what I really love about this animation is that you can see the moon in the background, and through all of these different wavelengths, it looks exactly the same size. And that's because it doesn't have an atmosphere. And so it's just completely opaque and absorbing. And so we don't see that change. So going back to the exoplanet question, the planets that I'm personally most interested in right now are super Earths and mini-Neptunes. And partially that's because we know from observations like this that they're actually the most common kinds of exoplanets. So those two peaks in that histogram I tend to think of as the smaller end, which planets just a little bit bigger than 1 Earth radius, as being super Earths. And then we have this dip. And then we have this second peak where we're looking at 2 to 3 Earth radii, and I think of those as mini-Neptunes. That I know that can be potentially contentious, but that's how I think of it in my head. And the reasoning for why we have these two very distinct sets of planets is kind of unresolved at the moment. And so we have all of these different theories. And one of them is photoevaporation, that all of these planets actually form as mini-Neptunes and then slowly get their atmosphere stripped away by this parent star. And so then they turn into something that looks more like a super Earth. Or we have things like core-powered mass loss or gas pore formation, where those things are actually forming as super Earths and mini-Neptunes distinctly. And that's how we end up with the planet population that we do. And so of course we'd like to observe this, but that can be challenging. Even more difficult is when we turn to a plot like this, which is, I realize, fairly busy. So I'll break it down for you. On the x-axis, we're looking at mass, and then on the y-axis, we're looking at radius. So this is just a mass radius diagram. And then the various colors, the solid lines in particular, are kind of very distinct bulk planetary compositions. So on the bottom, we're looking at like a completely iron planet. And then on the top, we're looking at a cold hydrogen helium planet, something like a Jupiter. And in the middle, we have these sort of toward the bottom, our familiar terrestrial planets. So you can see on that bottom left corner, we're looking at Earth and Venus, and something that's partially iron, but also partially rock. And then we also have some novel things like this completely water planet that's up a little bit higher. And so from our observations, it would be nice if we could nicely track a planet onto one of these particular bulk composition lines. But I want to draw your attention to all of these different scatter points. And for our non-solar system planets, you could say they have extremely large error bars. And so if you can imagine sliding these data points across different error bars, you can see we're crossing many, many different possibilities for bulk composition. So our observations alone right now aren't constraining this. And it actually gets even more complicated, which is, of course, the bulk of what I'm going to be talking about today, which are other things in the atmosphere that are absorbing differently than the gases. And so this little schematic, you can imagine on the top plot, we're looking at a big puffy atmosphere, which of course is going to be easier to see. But if there's a thick cloud layer high in that atmosphere, the photons are going to get blocked before we see them. And so to us, it's actually going to look like the same thing as if we had a very small atmosphere that's tightly held to the planet. And so the photons are going to reach us in the same way, and we won't necessarily be able to tell those two scenarios apart. If we think about this now in sort of a graphical form, the way that this might look is if we have a clear atmosphere, we will see a nice molecular signature, but depending where that cloud is, we'll see a break. And so here you can imagine that we're still seeing the tip of that sodium line, but it's truncated at the level of the cloud. And then of course, if the cloud were even higher, we wouldn't see anything at all, which might look the same to us as a planet with no atmosphere. Luckily, we are slowly pushing toward observations of smaller and smaller planets. And so I was really excited last year when these two results came out that we're actually finally getting detections of atmospheres on mini-Neptunes. So on the left, you're looking at K218b, a mini-Neptune where it's actually in the habitable zone of its parent star. And so we think we see water and water clouds in its atmosphere. And then on the right, we're looking at something slightly bigger, closer to a Neptune than a mini-Neptune, but still definitely one of the smallest planets we've been able to observe, 3470b. And again, we're actually seeing signatures of clouds toward the visible wavelengths, and then it gets clearer a little bit further out to the red. And so I just showed you those two. We think we see evidence of clouds, but Haze is another possibility for what we're seeing, and this planet, GJ1214b, is actually one of my favorites because it's kind of proving to us that clouds and haze matter in these atmospheres. So those other two are actually clear enough that we can get a decent handle on their atmospheres, but we've not actually been able to observe anything conclusive about GJ1214b, and this is why. So if you look at the top plot, that yellow line is what a clear hydrogen helium atmosphere would look like. And so the black data points clearly rule that out. But then if you move to the bottom plot, when we're looking at a methane or CO2 or water atmosphere, the points are actually kind of ruling those out too. It's far too flat. We're not seeing the signature of any of those kinds of atmospheres. However, GJ1214b is a fairly large mini-Neptune. It's like 2.6 Earth radii, and we can't conceive of a planet formation scenario that doesn't have this planet having a relatively large hydrogen atmosphere. That's telling us there has to be something else in the atmosphere that's suppressing these molecular signatures and compounding our observations. So clouds or hazes are probably almost certainly in this atmosphere. So I've mentioned this a couple times, so I want to be clear about what I mean. When I talk about haze, I usually actually mean photochemical haze, which are particles that are in the atmosphere that got there because of photochemistry. And so you can imagine you have your planetary atmosphere. We're looking at Titan here, which is sort of my favorite hazy atmosphere of the solar system. And so the UV photons from the sun come in, break apart those gases that make up the atmosphere, and then they reform as solid particles that stay suspended. So that's haze, just described on the left, and that's in contrast to what I'll call clouds, which are particles that are also suspended in the atmosphere, but they got there just through condensation. So changes in temperature and pressure, but it's a phase change, not a chemical change. And I will point out that across the solar system, we see hazes in worlds from Titan, which is on the left, which is this very thick atmosphere, even thicker than Earth's, all the way out to Pluto. This beautiful sort of blue ring around the planet is actually because of its extended haze layer, even though the atmosphere is so thin. We see actually haze in both of these cases. This is just another view, now looking through these dramatic haze layers. And haze is important not just from an exoplanet observation perspective, where it's confusing our observations, but hazes, because of their scattering or absorptive properties, can actually change the temperature structure. We think that's true on Pluto, where the high altitude haze is actually cooling the planet slightly from what we would expect at certain regions, and then it's actually heating it in others. So it's changing just throughout the atmosphere, the temperature structure. The bulk atmospheric composition can also change, because as we're feeding particular atmospheric gases into this haze formation process, we're actually, in potentially some cases, losing them from the atmosphere itself. And finally, both on the early Earth and then also Titan, we think that hazes can actually be, the haze formation process can be a really important part of forming prebiotic molecules. So that's your intro about what haze is, what the exoplanet question I'm focusing on is, but now we're going to actually move into the lab itself and try to untangle some of these problems that I've been describing. So in the phaser lab and Sarah Hurst's group, we've done this whole different series of planetary haze experiments. And so up on the top left there, you can see that's our standard Titan experiment, mostly in the yellow. So it's mostly nitrogen with some methane and carbon monoxide. And then we have this whole suite of exoplanet experiments. And so they cover hydrogen-rich, water-rich, and carbon dioxide-rich atmospheres at 800, 600, 400, and 300 Kelvin. So you can think of that as the inner edge of the habitable zone and then a little bit hotter. This is what the lab setup actually looks like. It's a custom-built setup, and so it's very mad science. And highlighted here, you can see the actual chamber where we run the experiments. And so we run the gases in, bring them to the temperatures that we'd like them to be, and then we have attached to the chamber itself either an AC plasma or a UV lamp, and that's simulating our photochemical process to break apart those gases so that they can then reform as solid haze particles. And so my part of this experiment has been to actually figure out what the solids are made of. And so the first step to doing that was we collected the solids and then performed combustion analysis on them just to get at their bulk composition. So this is just looking again at the gas phase composition, just slightly blown out so you can see what you're looking at. So again, we have sort of standard Titan on the top, which is mostly nitrogen, some methane, and a tiny bit of carbon monoxide. And then the two coolest of our water-rich cases are the other ones I'm showing you below. So you can see mostly water, lots of methane, and then touches of other gases. These are disks of what we actually collect from the chamber itself. And so you can see that they actually look pretty similar in color, and that was not the case for this whole suite of experiments. They actually are lots of different colors, but for these ones in particular, they look pretty much the same. They also made about the same amount of haze, although the production rates varied across all of these experiments. These ones were also very similar. So you might think that they're made of pretty similar stuff. However, our combustion analysis shows that they're very different. So you can see on the top there, again, Titan, and then the bottom two are our water-rich exoplanets. And both of those exoplanet cases have much more oxygen in the solid than the Titan mixture. And that might seem pretty obvious. Look at all of the oxygen that was in the starting gas mixture. But it's telling us that that oxygen is being readily incorporated into the solid, which was not necessarily going to be the outcome, although we do see it is. And so now we know the bulk composition, but we want to get a little bit more detail. And so to do that, we're using a technique called mass spectrometry. And if you are not familiar, I'll give you a tiny little crash course here. So on the x-axis, we're looking at the mass to charge, but you can really just think of it as the mass. And then on the y-axis, we're looking at the intensity. So just you can think of that as counts. And this is actually an image from the Cassini spacecraft when it flew through the plumes of Enceladus, which is what's in the background there. And so you can see at very particular masses, we see the signatures of particular molecules. So we see methane and water vapor kind of at the lower end, and then we start moving to higher and higher masses. We move to simple organics and then more complex organics. So that's kind of what a mass spec plot typically looks like, but I also want to draw your attention to the ranges you're looking at. So you're going from 10 to 50 mass to charge units here, and that will be important in a second. So first, the instrument I'm actually using is called an Orbitrap mass spectrometer, and so it's very high resolution, which is nice because we can resolve molecules that might have similar unit masses, so we can look a little bit more in detail. And so I'm just illustrating here how that works. But in order to actually perform this measurement, I have to take the solids we've made from our chamber and then dissolve them in a solvent in order to put them through the easy source. On the left there, I'm actually showing a vial of when I tried to do that. And I hope you can see at the bottom of that vial there, there's actually a layer of sediment. And that's because this supposedly very easy step in the experimental process was not so easy. I had a lot of trouble in some cases getting all of the samples to dissolve. We have to push through this animation just a second. Okay, skipping ahead. So when I talk about solubility now, I want to be clear that I didn't actually do quantitative solubility measurements. There are ways to do that. That was not the focus of this study. And so everything is just very much sort of by eye, whether or not we detected signal. And so that top plot you're looking at is the just a control solvent. There's no actual sample in there. And so you can see it's kind of a mess. Whereas the bottom had a really nicely soluble sample. And so you can see it has a lot of structure. And essentially that was what I did to figure out whether or not samples were soluble, in addition to looking and seeing if there was a bunch of sediment left at the bottom of the vial. And so I ended up with a plot that looks like this. And so you can divide this again into looking at the hydrogen-rich, the water-rich, and then the CO2-rich gas mixtures. Those are where those particles came from. And then again, 600, 400, 300 Kelvin. And the different colors of these boxes indicate the kind of solubility that I observed. And so a green box means, yes, it was soluble the first try. I got really nice signal from that sample with that solvent. The yellow means I thought I could see solvent either dissolving some of the sample. And so there's a color change perhaps in the vial, but then I didn't get good signal or vice versa. And so you can see I just kind of kept throwing more and more powerful organic solvents at these samples to try to get them to dissolve, and with sort of mixed results. But the interesting thing that actually came out of this is that anytime something was soluble, it was always with a polar solvent. And so I've highlighted here the ones that are polar solvents. And this is interesting, not only because it finally allowed me to get a handle on my experiment, but because it's actually something about the chemical behavior of the particles themselves. There's this saying in chemistry that like dissolves like. And so if polar solvents are effective, it's telling you probably that the particles, the samples themselves are also probably polar. And we have evidence from that from other measurements that the lab has taken. So these are actually microscope images of the disks that our particles are on. And so you can see, particularly in these two bottom middle cases, which were the most soluble in those polar solvents, that we're kind of seeing these linear chains of particles forming, which is also indicative of polar behavior. This is interesting, not just because now we know that the particles are polar, but because things like solubility actually matter for cloud formation. Generally speaking, soluble particles are better cloud condensation nuclei, or cloud seeds. And so that's illustrated in this schematic here. So all of the brown dots are your particles, so in this case, hazes. And then if they encounter this droplet of water vapor, it actually engulfs the particle and forms a cloud seed. And that's what's enabling cloud formation. And it's important to note that cloud condensation nuclei are important, very important on Earth. You actually need such high supersaturations of water on Earth to form clouds. That case pretty much never happens except for in very particular parts of the atmosphere. And yet we see clouds throughout Earth's atmosphere. And that's because of the presence of all of these cloud condensation nuclei, which on Earth can come from things like salt from the ocean, or anthropogenic aerosols that are released as pollution, to even things like pollen and organic matter. And that's what's actually enabling all the different kind of clouds we see on Earth. But it's important not just on Earth. I really love this study that came out last year from Victoria Hartwick, who's now at Ames, and she actually was able to show that there are all these different parts in the middle atmosphere of Mars where we see clouds, we observe them, we know they're there, and yet models were unable to form any clouds there. And so she led this paper that showed if you just account for meteoritic impacts impinging on the upper atmosphere, the smoke from those impacts is actually enough of a cloud seed to kickstart the cloud formation where we need it to be on Mars. So I think it's just a really beautiful example illustrating the importance of caring about cloud condensation nuclei, which we're seeing maybe our hazes can act that way for polar condensable materials. Okay, now we're going to go back to the mass spec. So I showed you this plot already, but we're going to take a little bit of a deeper look. And so I want to remind you, when I mentioned looking at that Cassini mass spec, that it topped out at 50 MZ. And so now we're looking at something that starts at 150 and goes all the way out past 450. So that's just telling you that these are very, very complex molecules that we've made in the lab and are trying to characterize. And so then now I want to return your attention to this very regular repeating stair-step structure. And so that's indicating to us that there are chemical units that are being repeated here. You can also think of that as chemical families, like a repeating methyl group or something. And also to highlight here, I'm going to zoom in on this area now. And so that's actually what we're able to resolve with the Orbitrap. So it's very high resolution, and that means that we can resolve individual molecular identities rather than having a mixture that we can't necessarily untangle. So these are actually now the results from the Exoplanet lab hazes across a whole swath of them. So these are just the hydrogen-rich mixtures. And again, we're looking from hottest to coldest, top to bottom. And so those top two were actually not soluble. And so I hope you notice now that you've had your crash course that they're kind of a mess. We don't really get anything usable out of that. But then the bottom case, the 300 Kelvin, actually does begin to have some of this pretty stair-step structure, meaning I got signal, they were soluble, I could get usable data out of this. And what's interesting that's different about this particular mixture, you can see on the left, I'm showing you the original gas mixtures. They're very similar, except for the addition of ammonia to this starting mix. And that seems to have made enough of a difference in the chemistry of the solid materials that it was soluble and that I could get usable data out of it, even though it's there at just very trace amounts. Now we're looking at the water-rich mixtures, and so you can see all of them were really pretty and soluble. And they actually have differences between them. You can see in the structure of the mass spec that they're not all the same in chemical structure, but they all were soluble. And so once we have the mass spec data, because it's so, the molecules themselves are so complex and there are so many molecular detections, it would be sort of unreasonable for me to sit there and look at each individual peak and decide what molecule that peak corresponded to. I would probably have to spend the next 100,000 years doing my PhD, which is not the goal. So instead, I use this software that was actually developed by my advisor while she was in grad school. And essentially, it just takes the mass spec that I showed you, and takes the mass to charge against the intensity, and then it runs it through essentially a series of decision trees. And so I know relatively how well the instrument was working, and so I can give it a mass tolerance. I know from my bulk composition measurements, from the combustion analysis, what the carbon to nitrogen ratio should be. There are various chemical rules, like the nitrogen rule, that you can use to narrow down your options. And then it also takes the lower mass assignments, where there are fewer possibilities for what a molecule could be, to inform what chemically makes sense for the larger masses. And from there, you make an assignment. And so what I can actually do once I've gone through that process is add up all of the molecular identifications I was able to make from the mass spec and turn that into an elemental analysis format to then compare to what I got from the bulk composition analysis from combustion, to make sure that I'm doing like a good job of identifying the molecules. And so I've just highlighted this one column here. And so within error, we are actually agreeing, which is telling me, yes, my softwares are doing a good job identifying what's actually in the sample. So now we're looking at, again, just bulk composition, but across all of the different soluble samples that I was able to measure. And so again, I hope the biggest thing you see from this is that oxygen is much more important in the exoplanet samples as compared to a Titan haze particle, which is over all the way on the right. But it's not just that there's more oxygen, we can actually say something a little bit more than that. And so if you look at that middle section, which are all the water-rich cases, you can see that the one I've highlighted, the 600 Kelvin case, actually has the most oxygen in the solid particle. However, it actually had the least amount of oxygen overall in the gas mixture. We think this is happening because of the water-rich cases, the 600 Kelvin was the only one to have carbon monoxide as a gas as compared to the other two. And so we think that it actually enabled the inclusion of much more oxygen in the haze particles, because we're more easily able to build up haze particles on top of that CO, rather than trying to break the water molecules to make haze, which is why those other two don't have quite as much oxygen in them. And so that's also, again, I mentioned earlier, the importance of ammonia and that hydrogen-rich mixture. And all of this is just kind of pointing to me to the importance of trace species in the haze formation process. And we also see that here. So this is from our hottest set of experiments at 800 Kelvin. And so all the work I've been showing you was just for the up to 600, but we have actually gotten a little further now to a slightly hotter gas mix. And so this particular experiment actually had tiny amounts of hydrogen sulfide, just at 1.6%, so a very small amount of hydrogen sulfide. And yet we see that on the left plot, when you don't have hydrogen sulfide, of course, you don't see any sulfur products, but even though it's present at such a small amount, as soon as you add it in, you quite quickly start building up a lot of sulfur. And that's in the gas phase. And then if you look at the solid products, which is what's shown on the pie graph there, anytime you see an S there, that's indicating that we see a sulfur product in the solid particles. So again, just trace species in haze is very important to figure out their chemical nature. So now I'm actually showing you some of the molecular identifications I was able to make. And so here I'm just showing molecules that have some sort of role to play in prebiotic chemistry. And so you can see we have, sorry, didn't mean to click. You can see we have the presence of something that might be consistent with glyceraldehyde, and then a number of amino acids, and actually adenine, which is a nucleotide base. So this is for the hydrogen-rich mixtures. I don't expect you to be able to read this. This is just to kind of illustrate that we made tons and tons of different identifiable prebiotic molecules, or things that are consistent with prebiotic molecules in the water-rich cases. And so this is just to show you that there's a lot of them And then this is from the carbon dioxide rich mixture. Not as many, but still a number of these interesting different kinds of molecules. This is a different way of visualizing that. So these are called Van Krevelen diagrams, and essentially they're just plots of elemental ratios. So you can see that there's hydrogen to carbon on the y-axis and then oxygen to carbon on the x. And so it's kind of this crazy scatter plot, but if you actually divide it into the different regions, as I have on the far left plot, I've also labeled them, it kind of tells you the nature of these molecules, of where they fit in this phase space. So you can see that top left region corresponds to something that's like a carboxylic acid, which are like a fatty acid. This middle section, something that's more amino-like, and then various kinds of hydrocarbons toward the bottom. And then this region off to the right that's consistent with carbohydrates. So like I said, those simple sugars that we're identifying in the samples. And if you, again, draw your attention to the middle plot, which are those water-rich mixtures, which were the most soluble, we were able to make the most identifications. You can see that's borne out here, and that just there's so much stuff in this graph. But I think what's really interesting is if you look at it divided by color, which correspond to the different temperature of experiments, you can see, again, in the red is the 600 Kelvin, and we have all of that extra material in the amino group, which also corresponds to more oxygen being present in that sample. And so combining my work, which is the solid phase chemistry, with other results we've gotten from the lab with the gas phase, we can try to start to build a pathway for how these molecules are forming. And so we see from the gas phase that we produce things like formaldehyde and HCN, which are known as precursors to things like sugars and amino acids. And so it's just kind of, again, telling us this is perhaps how this chemistry is forming. And more than that, I think this is interesting as a kind of just suggestion of how prebiotic chemistry could be occurring on various planets. So if you think about the origin of life, there are kind of several proposed ideas for how that happens. And so one of them is that it's happening in the deep ocean next to hydrothermal vents, or the other one is that it's material that's being delivered extraterrestrially, so from comets and meteorites through, like, that's the traditional kind of panspermia idea. But I think that these results are actually suggestive that the atmosphere itself can pretty quickly start to build some pretty important prebiotic material, because we're seeing things that are consistent with simple sugars and amino acids and nucleobases. And so from the atmosphere itself, it actually can start seeding the planet with stuff that can kickstart that process. So that's the optimistic, we figured out how this works perspective. But the other half of this is that all of these are suggestions, and I've been careful to say is consistent with or is suggestive of, and that's because these materials are very complex, as I showed you, and there are a lot of overlapping peaks. And so while we can make the molecular identifications relatively confidently, there are multiple possible structures for those molecular identifications. And so it could actually be an isomer of the thing that I've identified, and it could be something that's not useful in prebiotic chemistry at all. But I can't tell that just from my mass spec measurements. My collaborators who use the mass spec lab are actually still working to see what they can do to actually narrow down the molecular structure, and so confirm whether or not the molecules that I've suggested could be consistent with these formulas is actually what's there. Okay, so that's kind of the end of the lab section for the moment. And very quickly, I want to motivate now how we can use this information, both in models and then looking toward future observations. So I'm sure you've seen this plot several times. This is kind of the whole family of different exoplanet missions that are both on sky and soon, and maybe even not so soon, to be on sky. And so the point here is just that we've barely tapped the surface of what we can actually do with observations from Hubble, and we're just going to keep pushing forward and having more and more information. So it's important to be able to translate what we learn from the lab into something usable for observers. So other work that's come out of the lab that has not been something I've worked on include things like the production rate, which is what you're looking at there, where now you're seeing this very high production rate from the 2 water-rich cases, and then sort of lesser for the hydrogen. And then also we have a handle on the particle sizes here from the various kinds of experiments we've done. And so you can see that there is scatter here, but they're all actually relatively small. They top out at like 200 nanometers at the most. And the size of the particles is actually important for the observational signature you see. And so this is actually looking at how changing the particles, which are labeled there, changes the size of a feature that you will see when you're looking at an atmosphere in transmission. And so we use this information to actually do a study on the TRAPPIST-1 planets and say, okay, we know the particles are basically Rayleigh scatters because they're so small. And so we'll treat them that way, and we'll just keep sort of agnostically adding haze into the atmospheric model and seeing how much we need to match the observations that Hubble took of the TRAPPIST planets, which is shown there. But then when we had that model fitting, we kind of took a step back and said, okay, does the lab say that this is a reasonable result? And the answer is no. It says that to make that kind of amount of haze in a hydrogen-rich atmosphere is just totally outside the realm of like what should be physically possible. And so we were able to say, okay, it's not a hazy hydrogen-rich atmosphere for these planets. We then kind of took the next step and said, okay, what if they're clouds instead? And so we did the same process, just saying, I don't know what the cloud is. I'm just going to put it where I need it to be to match the observations. And you end up with clouds way up in the thermosphere of the planet. This is for TRAPPIST-1d in particular. And this is not just a hazy, thin sort of cloud, it's a thick, opaque, completely obscuring cloud. So to create and sustain such a thing that high in the atmosphere is similarly like pretty physically unreasonable. And so now we're actually moving on from just those physical parameters that we got from the lab and actually trying to use some of the chemical information I've gotten. So I've been working with Daria, formerly of Goddard, now of UC Riverside, to work to understand some other planets. So we're looking at the L9859 system. And so we're taking that I've learned that these particles are probably very oxygen rich. And then also some of them could potentially contain substantial amounts of sulfur, sulfuric acid, to inform the kind of clouds and haze that we are considering for these atmospheres. And so that's still ongoing work that I'm excited about. And so finally, to tease you with what hopefully I'll be able to do soon when we can get back into the lab. These are sort of proxy measurements that we've been taking from the lab and transferring to an atmospheric model for observers. But the ultimate goal is actually to measure the optical properties of these hazes themselves. So then that's a direct input into a model. And so this is kind of a spaghetti plot of many, many different cloud condensates that have been used by exoplanet observers to try to understand what they're seeing in atmospheres. And so I'll just highlight here that this dashed black line is what's their only haze that's considered, and it's tholin, and it's specifically meaning a Titan nitrogen methane mixture. And that's the only kind of haze that's currently being considered because it's the only kind of optical properties that we have measurements for right now. But I hope I've shown you that hazes can be made of many different sorts of things. And so we really need to get those optical properties to understand what it is we could be seeing. So to summarize here, our exoplanet hazes seem to be polar soluble, which means that they might be good cloud condensation nuclei for polar condensables. And I'll point out that water is a polar condensable. These hazes are very complex. Typically, exoplanet people like to say hydrocarbon haze, but I hope I've shown you that that's not a particularly good description because of all of the oxygen and sulfur that can be readily incorporated into these materials. Finally, we identify some very interesting prebiotic molecular formula. We are still working to confirm that those are the molecules that are actually there, but either way, it's suggestive that a prebiotic pathway might be available just in the atmosphere of these exoplanets. And finally, we're just very beginning to take what we're learning from the lab and apply it to atmospheric models so that we can be useful for observers. And I would love to take any questions that you might have.
Thank you, Sarah, so much. That was a great talk. So if anyone wants to ask a question, if you could just raise your hand, or you can type it into the chat. I think Avi, you had a question?
Yeah, a great talk, Sarah. Really interesting. I also was really impressed how you ranged over so many different areas from observations all the way to, lab chemistry. That I'm an observer sort of by trade and by kind of orientation. And, the thing that of course is so scary for observers is when you see so many degenerate results, as in trace species make a huge impact on the sort of final chemistry, and yet they're very hard to discriminate from spectra, low resolution spectra. This last plot you showed from Hannah obviously suggests that there's some structure that could be discriminated, but I was wondering, when we have planets where we know only the mass, radius, maybe the hydrogen content of the atmosphere, or the mean molecular weight, you could say. I don't know, have you thought about ways that we could use population level sort of comparisons ranging over things like the planet's, temperature or sort of mass, atmospheric mass, or some sort of interesting variables that might really discriminate between some of these cloud scenarios that are, that we can't actually determine, for example, the hydrocarbon content of the upper atmosphere or whatever. Anyway, I just thought maybe you had some ideas about that.
That's an interesting problem. In terms of population studies, I feel that we're like far too much in the infancy of understanding photochemistry on exoplanets to kind of even begin to say anything conclusively. I'm sure there's work you could do to kind of narrow down what's possible. Like you said, with temperature, like there are certain trace species we would expect to be locked up in the deep atmosphere and that we don't have to worry about. Beyond that, I'm really not, like, temperature is probably your best discriminant, honestly, because in terms of the actual composition of the atmosphere, even like I said, even if it's dominated by something else, tiny traces of other things could completely change the picture. So yeah, I think probably just kind of getting a handle on the temperature and so what species should even be possible as gas phase is probably the best bet.
Yeah, I think the other information we'll have after the first cycle of JW will be kind of sort of massive bulk constituents, as in, is it a hydrogen dominated or a high mean molecular weight atmosphere? Is it CO?
Yeah, that's true. And I think that will help in terms of, you need a bulk constituent that's going to be conducive to making haze. And so if you have something that has just no carbon species at all, I would imagine it's pretty hard to make haze in that atmosphere. And so that would be helpful, certainly.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Great. And I think, Melissa, you have a question?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, perfect. Okay. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the decision-making in your gas mixtures and like their specific mixing ratios in addition to the compounds you chose.
Yeah, that's a great question. So the short answer is we don't know what exoplanet atmospheres are made of to this level. So at some level, we're always going to be making it up for now. So the way that this was actually done is Julie Moses, who's at the Space Science Institute, I believe, ran just an equilibrium chemistry model for this temperature, this metallicity, what are the gas phase species you have, what's there at more than 1% mixing ratios. Those are the gases we're going to consider, just to have some handle on where to start. I think that resulted in some, honestly, pretty confounding results in some cases, because it's very hard to untangle when temperature is the deciding factor versus the particular gas. And so the kind of next phase of experiments that we're going to be doing is actually to control each of those things individually and say, okay, holding this temperature steady, we're going to go through these different gas mixtures, or holding this gas mixture steady, we're going to do it at different temperatures to kind of figure out what's the driving factor in things. But yeah, for this, it was just equilibrium chemistry calculations.
Okay, cool. And then my second question is, when you were dissolving the solids, I was wondering if you tried dissolving the solids in a mixture of solvents that had a different range of polarities, like mixtures of polar solvents and nonpolar solvents, just so that you could try dissolving more of everything?
Yes, I did actually do mixtures.
Did you notice a difference?
I'm trying to think if I actually did any. So I glossed over that a little bit because I always started with methanol, but then when I did other mixtures, I had already dissolved it in the methanol. So in fact, all of those were mixtures. Nothing was purely nonpolar, just based on the amount of sample we had. So I actually.
Fine. All right, thank you.
Great. And I think, Vlad, you had a question?
Yes, hello, Sarah. Thanks for a great talk. And so you covered great variety of molecular molecules formed in different environments. So the one question that I have is about specifically when you're talking about like prebiotic chemistry. So what kind of energy source do you use? So for that, to form, let's say, adenine. And if you do form adenine, do you see also, any traces of amino acids? And so, what's the ratio of mixing ratios of those molecules? So, can you please?
Yeah. So we saw evidence of those molecular formulas from both the different energy sources we used, which are an AC plasma, which is able to break apart all of the molecules that we include in the gas phase, and then also a UV lamp, which can only do double and single bonded molecules in terms of breaking them up. It can't do the triple bonds. But we saw not adenine in particular, but we saw amino acids in every case from both energy sources. In terms of quantifying the mixing ratios of those things we're making, that's a little harder, especially with the Orbitrap instrument, to get a quantitative amount of the different materials we're making, because it's a function of how well things ionize in addition to the amount that's present in the sample itself. And so I would hesitate to say the amounts we're making. I would say trace.
Yeah, so I think that, in order to make more definitive conclusions about these nitrogen-based molecules, you might want to also use, instead of nitrogen-14, regular nitrogen-15 to avoid contamination.
Right. Yeah, there are ways you could, if you wanted to follow up, you could definitely do particular isotopes to try to trace exactly what's being made and where. That was, again, this was very much an exploratory kind of study.
Right.
So we didn't do that this time, but we could in future experiments for sure.
Yeah, and another comment I just want to make in response to Avi's question about the the different factors that's affecting the chemical composition, photochemistry driven. So it's temperature definitely one of the important factors, but another factor that probably is important is not just UV emission. It's a spectral distribution. Right. How much energy you have in the high UV, in the far UV versus near UV. So that will actually also change the equation.
That's a really good point that I didn't mention talking to Avi, but yes, the star should make a big difference. And so knowing very specifically the spectral distribution of various types of stars should also be able to narrow down when haze is going to be an important factor.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Great. Anyone else have any other questions for Sarah? I have a quick one, Sarah. This is probably a bit naive, but I was curious if you could talk any more about, you mentioned the particle size in its solubility and also its observational signatures, but I was curious if you've looked at the shape. I've known this has come up for Pluto hazes, where folks have looked at if haze particles are more spherical or like fractal in their shape, and that changes like their settling rates and stuff like that. And I was just wondering if the shape has any effect on like the solubility or the observational signature.
Yes, it should have an effect on both. Sorry, I'm trying to scroll back to. So this is basically the constraint we have on the shape right now. So you can see that some are more spherical than others, but they're all roughly spherical. And it's partly a function of how our setup works of where we're making hazes. And so it's relatively high in the atmosphere. That doesn't preclude the idea that these tiny particles that we're making can actually attach to each other and grow into something that's more fractal. So knowing like how sticky they are compared to each other and whether or not they're going to be able to make these more fractal structures would help. My former grad student, colleague who's now at UC Santa Cruz, Xinting Yu, has actually done a lot of work on that for Titan hazes. To figure out how particles will interact with each other to see how they will grow. And her work, at least for the Titan particles, shows that they're very sticky. And so maybe these are too. She would have to follow up and see if that's true. But yeah, I think that there's definitely a potential for these particles to act that way, but we don't have a constraint yet.
Gotcha. Thank you so much. All right. Any final questions for Sarah? If not, I thank you again, Sarah, for talking with us today. It was a great talk, and I think there was a good discussion afterwards. So I think Sarah's email was on the last slide there. So if you do have any other follow-up questions, feel free to send them over to her. And thank you, everyone, for coming out today. Have a good day.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Sarah. Bye.
Thank you, Sarah.